I'm sure you already know how critical some measurements on a bike can be. Sometimes you've got to be more accurate than the width of a human hair. So I'd like to show you some instruments which are accurate to the tiniest dimensions, but they all measure in metric increments, so if you're not completely comfortable with metrics, go back and look at the metric introduction. This is a horizontal or wobble dial indicator. It measures small amounts of movement, such as ring and pinion backlash. This is a standard dial indicator. It measures larger amounts of movement. Add these parts to a dial indicator, and you get a dial bore gauge. A dial bore gauge measures inside diameter. On the face, you see two scales. This outer scale is marked in increments of hundredths of a millimeter. It has a movable reference point to make reading easier. When this tracer pin moves, it activates the needle movement. One full revolution of the outer needle moves the inner needle one increment, or 1 millimeter. So the inner scale registers large amounts of movement. On the back, this fixture allows you to attach different holding devices to it. The dial bore gauge is similar. The dial indicator is attached here in the long handle. These extension rods come in various lengths to measure different sized bores. Let's use a dial indicator to measure crankshaft end play. Take a test reading just for practice. Can you read this? Remember, the whole millimeters are on the inner scale, the hundredths are on the outer scale. 10/100ths of a millimeter. Here's another one. The inner dial is reading less than 1. The outer dial reads 82/100ths, 0.82 millimeters. Now that's the easy part. But when you're measuring movement, you're usually measuring a range of movement. So you've got to preload the dial indicator to allow the tracer pin to move in and out. Make sure the tracer pin stays in contact with the object. Then rotate it slowly and find the minimum deflection point. Here. Then rotate the outer dial so that the 0 lines up with the pointer. Pay attention to the inner dial reading here between 0 and 1. Now rotate the wheel and find the maximum reading. Here. The inner dial is still less than 1, but the outer dial points to 16. Your reading is 16/100ths of a millimeter. Easy, huh? Let's try another one. Here's the preload at 3.21 millimeters. Now rotate the outer dial. Here's our maximum reading. Look at the inner dial. The minimum was at 3. It's now at 4. We traveled 1 whole millimeter. Now look at the outer scale, 13/100ths. The movement was 1.13 millimeters. You see, you don't have to be a math whiz to use these tools. It just takes a little practice. Now, if there's something you didn't understand, just roll the tape back and look at this section again. Okay? To check the backlash of the final drive gears, attach a wobble dial indicator to its stand and measure the gear here. Set the preload about halfway through its movement and rotate the pinion gear to find the gear backlash. Another critical check is the measurement of a bore. A bore is a precision hole that is perfectly circular throughout its entire length. You measure a bore for inside diameter, which is the distance between these two walls. If you're measuring an engine cylinder, there are other concerns, which you'll find covered in the program on boring bars. Now, these dimensions are critical. So how do we take them? With a dial bore gauge. The dial indicator goes here in the top of the handle. Loosen this knurled locking cap and gently push it in until the pointers read about 1 millimeter of preload. Now tighten the knurled locking cap snugly. Down here you attach the rod. the part that actually goes into the cylinder. You need to find the size that will work best for the cylinder you're measuring. If one size is too short and the next size is too long, just add one or two of these spacers to give you the correct length. Then tighten everything in place with this knurled locking cap. Be sure the bore is clean. Any dirt or contamination will affect your reading. The rod spacer combination should insert easily into the bore. Rock the gauge back and forth and see that the tracer points maintain contact with the walls. See the pointer wind clockwise, stop, and wind counterclockwise? If it doesn't do this, change your rod and spacer combination. Okay, now we're almost ready to measure the bore. To do it right, though, you need a few more tools. You need a pen and paper and the appropriate size micrometer. Adjust the micrometer to the standard dimension given in the shop manual. Then, place the rod end of the dial bore gauge between the measuring surfaces. Turn the outer scale to align with the outer needle. The gauge is now zeroed, so the calculation can be read directly by subtracting your reading from the standard. Now, insert the tracer end of the gauge into the bore. Slowly rock it back and forth. At the point where the needle stops, check the reading, subtract the piston size, and record your results. When you're inspecting a cylinder, front to back and left to right measurements check it for out of round. Measuring at 3 different levels checks for tapering. Now, check your figures. If they don't meet service manual specs, you may need to replace the cylinder. When you're finished with the bore gauge, take it apart and clean it. Might also take a little light oil. Like all precision tools, treat it with care and store it safely.
Complete the worksheet that is identified for this video. If you need assistance, see your instructor.